My name is SABIQ FAUZY ABDURROZZAQ. We will discuss about post-colonial theory, mainly Edward Said post-colonial theory. What is post-colonialism? Colonialism is the policy of practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting economically. Post-colonialism, the critical academic study of the cultural, political, and economic legacy of the colonialism and imperialism, focusing on the human consequences of the control and exploitation of colonized people and their land. So, colonialism is when a country or nation subjugate other nation and make that nation as their subject, colonizer as the master, and colonized people as the servant. Post-colonialism is not about time period, but rather is about what happened after colonialism. What happened to the colonized people after their colonizer were gone. So what happened to them physically, psychologically, and spiritually after their oppressor gone. We're talking about Edward Said's theory, so we should know him first. He was born in Jerusalem in 1935, died in New York in 2003, teaching at Columbia University during his life in the USA. He's the one who's responsible for bringing post-colonialism to the academic discourse. Before him, the post-colonialism was not the mainstream academic discourse. He's the one who brought post-colonialism into the mainstream academic discourse with his book Orientalism, which is his most praised and widely acclaimed book. What is Orientalism? Orientalism is, in the literal definition, is Eastern, generally include the Middle East, South Asia, and Far East Asia, such as Japan, China, and other, or every territory that was once belonged to European imperial powers, especially the British and French Empire, and also the American to some extent. You may notice he only mentioned British and French because he was Palestinian, and in that time, British and the French was the one who colonized the Middle East. Other and alter ego. Every culture needs other culture to define itself, and this need to identify themselves is generally competitive. In the case of Orientalism, the East is the ultimate other for the West. In other words, Orientalism is the Western construction of what East is. The Orient must exist in order to the West to be the West. For example, the West are civilized. By what metric they consider themselves civilized? Because the East are not civilized, because the East are barbaric. The West is progressive because the East was backward. So the West need the East to have self-identity. Orientalism, according to Orientalism by Edward Said, Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and most of the time the Occident. The Occident is the West. Orientalism is a field of academic research that includes everyone who teaches, investigates, and writes about Orient. Orientalism is a corporate institution for dealing with the Orient beginning in the 18th century. So before colonialism, before the colonial era, Orientalism is just everyone who teaches, investigates, and writes about Orient out of curiosity and for the pursuit of knowledge. But after the colonial era, Orientalism became heavily politicized, and everyone who teaches and investigates and writes about Orient has interest, mainly imperial interest, not pure for knowledge anymore. Orientalism today. Said argued that today's Orientalism began from the 1970s, characterized with the great colonial expansion into the Orient, culminating in the Second World War, all the way to this day, where the United States is replacing the old British and French Empire and help to perpetuate the dynamics of Orientalism in their representation of Islam and Arab in four categories. First, popular image and social representation. The treatment of Arab and Islam by Orientalists are prescriptive and routinely negative as they derive from the transference the popular anti-Semitic animus from Jews to Arab. Said asserts it is the academic studies that support this negative image. These images are actually the negative caricature of Islam and Islamic culture. Second, public policy. The contemporary scholar tried to perpetuate the studies insight by the European Orientalists, such as the absolute difference between the East and the West, superiority of the West over the East, the tendency to control. So they have to maintain the difference between the East and the West. They believe that the East and the West are fundamentally different, therefore they are superior, and it is their duty and obligation to subjugate us, to save us from ourselves. Third, Islam. Said attacks the alleged inherent inability of the Muslim Near Orient to be as richly human as the West. According to this view, the Muslim mind is capable of only 4 out of 8 human thought processes. To this, he adds the presumption of the president of the Middle East Study Association that since the Arab language is much given to rhetoric, the Arab are consequently incapable of true thought. Even the president of Middle East Studies Association believes that the Arab are incapable of true thought because of the belief that Western are superior and the Orient are inferior. This belief is still being perpetuated to very this day for imitation of the West. Said places and takes on the contemporary Western orientalist presumption that Orient is an imitation of the West. He also highlights their effort to encourage the Easterner to judge themselves by Western criteria and to work for achieving the Western goal. Said deposed that the modern Orient has fallen for debate and is practicing its own Orientalism. So everything, every achievement, every Eastern achievement is just imitation of the West. We are incapable of producing greatness ourselves. Every greatness come from the West, the East is merely an imitation of the West. Some people actually believe this and believe that the Eastern couldn't progress if they're not being westernized. So in a way, they are unknowingly perpetuating the idea that in order to progress, the East must become the West. Therefore, the Western is superior than the East. Orientalism and domination. Orientalism was not objective field of study it came to be, rather it created a space in which justification of Occidental's political and cultural domination could be imposed on the Orient. Like Foucault, Said believed knowledge is power. The knowledge of the Orient, though flawed, provided the power base from which the colonizer set about their mission. The pure and political knowledge. An example of pure knowledge is basic math. It was and is hardly possible for 2 plus 2 equal 4 to enable the domination of another group. Political knowledge, on the other hand, lends itself handily from specialist to policy. Said demonstrated how policymakers seek out the specialists, in this case the Orientalists, to shape their politics. This policy often involved the domination of those that the specialist studies, and thus demonstrated Said's and Foucault's conception of knowledge as power. Said solution. Edward Said proposed some solution about Orientalism. First, detaching ourselves from the Western construction perspective of the East should represent of itself and for itself. So we must reject the notion that we are inferior from the West and we should represent ourselves. The East should represent itself. Second, acknowledging the differences between pure and political knowledge. According to Said, pure knowledge is the lack of mathematics, while political knowledge is the knowledge contrasted for power. So, the political knowledge is not neutral. They have interest and agenda behind it. So, we must carefully examine the political knowledge so we couldn't fall into the assumption that we are inferior from the West. We have to differentiate between the pure and political knowledge, and we must examine very carefully about political knowledge so we can free ourselves from the Western shackle. Thank you. That's all from me. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.